Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon when you're watching uh, this video. This is a overarching broad video, and it will include multiple aspects of the book. So you're going to hear me say some things that come directly from the book, other things that come directly from my understanding of doing the job and being a part of it, and everything else in the middle. If this was in a face-to-face class, this lecture would probably end up taking at least 2 or 3 class periods, but because it's just me, there's no feedback. I might chop it up into smaller categories as we go on. So I want to first talk about the concept of Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, right? And so these 3 terms get bounced around, and there are people who have a particular stance, like I'm only for Black Lives Matter, I'm only for Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter. All these constructs are a direct. It is a direct result of individuals feeling as if they're not actually being solved. And so I think that as you hear folks who are from the Black Lives Matter camp who continue to say Black lives don't appear to matter, so we're going to say something about it, this can lead to other people feeling as if that only people of color, only Black people are talking about folks of color. So what about all lives matter? And of course, you've got law enforcement on the front line dealing with the good and the bad of all of these things. And so you now have a movement called Blue Lives Matter. But I want to start out by saying that history impacts the future. So whatever you have done in the past will come to impact the future unless you are actively doing things to change that. And that's because in America and in most places that are westernized, you have what's called foundationalism, which means one idea builds on another and another and another. The reason why this is so powerful is that you can literally build a structure based upon a false understanding of the truth. And so I think that it's important that we are constantly deconstructing the past so that we don't have to repeat it, right? So that's an important thing to understand, is that we are foundational beings. The understanding part of the future will always be based on the past. I want to talk about a couple of the amendments and why they are so important to today. We have the 13th Amendment, and there's even a TV show on Netflix called The 13th. And basically, the 13th Amendment reads as 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution abolishes slavery and involuntary servitude except for punishment for a crime. So you can no longer be held for to do hard labor for not doing a crime. So that's now against the law, 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, the amendment addresses citizenship rights and equal protection of the law. So the 13th Amendment basically says we can no longer hold you and make you work for free for any reason unless you've been incarcerated. And 14, equal rights of the laws abound for every people, for all people groups. Make sense? Yes. Okay. Then there's the 15th, which argues the United States Constitution prohibits the federal and state governments from denying a citizen's right to vote based upon a citizen's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So these are the 3, what I would call 3 major civil rights amendments that move the work forward in a positive way. 13th, 14th, 15th. So I want to ask you a question. This is highly important. I'm not really going to ask you the question. I'm going to tell you what I found. So as someone who is a former police officer who does a great deal of training with police officers, I've come to realize that if you answer yes to this next question, you have to answer yes to the next. And the first question I will ask, and I ask you just like this: can anyone, if you can, give me 10 good reasons why 9/11 should be forgotten? Right. And so when I ask that question to a room full of cops, people get very anxious. The people start moving around. I've had a few cops stand up and say, "What are you talking about? How can you ever forget 9/11?" And then I say, "Okay, well then you can't give me 10 good reasons. Let's talk about 10 good reasons why you should never forget about 9/11." And then literally the list goes on and on and on. excuse me, about all the reasons why you should never, ever forget about 9/11. So then I'll ask the question, why should we never forget about 9/11? People will say things like, if you don't remember the past, you are condemned to repeat them in the future. The amount of lives that were lost, the amount of damage that was lost, the amount of safety that was lost. And so all these are fantastic reasons why you would never, ever, ever want to forget 9/11. So after I asked that question, I asked the next question, when should we ever get over and forget about slavery? And people just kind of stop and they freeze. Because it's also an historic event that also included the death of millions of people, the destruction of property, the transatlantic sailing of lost bodies, the removal of culture, religion. These are very harmful things that still impact us today. So if you can say that you should never forget about 9/11 because 9/11 was awful, and 9/11, the impacts of 9/11 can still be felt today, but then you cannot say we should forget about slavery because it's the same thing. History has a way of repeating itself if it's not checked. And so again, if you can say we can never forget about 9/11 because we don't want to repeat it, we should never forget about slavery because we don't want to repeat it. Make sense? All right. So the history of race and policing. So way back, probably around in the 1700s, mid 1700s, we started having local law enforcement. And local law enforcement had two main responsibilities. The first was centralized municipal policing, which meant policing neighborhoods, or not, but townships where there were structures being built to keep the peace, whatever that peace might be. That was one job. The other job of local law enforcement was slave patrol. And if you are unaware of this, you should be aware of this, that local law enforcement in the 1700s had two responsibilities. One was protection of townships. The other one was going out to find slaves that had run away. Early 1700s, right? So we have these two timelines here. We have this timeline of law enforcement using its power, right? Its power and authority in such a way to go find runaway slaves and bring them back. Because during the time, slavery was legal and running away was illegal. Again, we should be mindful of thinking that all of our modern day laws are still justifiable. Because back in the 1700s, people thought that, well, this is a justifiable law. Slavery is legal. You ran away. You're my property. I own you, blah, 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 blah. Which just goes to show that just because the majority of the people believe something to be morally correct doesn't mean it's justifiable. Just saying, okay? So we're going to take a look at what I call the slavery or the racial oppression timeline. So slavery begins in 1619 in Jamestown, right? And that's an important thing to consider, that the very first slaves that were brought here were forced here in Jamestown. The U.S. gained its independence July 4th, 1776, which is important. But we also have the end of slavery in 1865, right? And the end of slavery was kind of the emancipation for slaves. And so I'm very mindful. So as a former police officer and a former military person, I have no problem celebrating the 4th of July, Independence Day, but I also celebrate Juneteenth. And Juneteenth is the celebration of 1865, the freeing of the slaves. But there are a lot of folks who are African American that I know that do not celebrate the 4th of July, not because they don't love this country, it's because their ancestors were not free. And if that doesn't make sense to you, then I don't know how else to share it, except for not everyone shares the same core values based upon their ancestry. Again, that's something to really be mindful of. So we have 1865 to 1877, we have what's called Reconstruction. And during Reconstruction, we have two major modes that take place that are highly important that you need to be aware of. Number one, there's the passing of the Black Code, and there's the Grandfather Clause. Now, being able to read is an important skill set to have in the modern day. If you cannot read, that's a major problem. But you have to imagine in 1865, it was even a bigger deal if you could not read, right? If you could not read, the majority of your life was bound by just being pragmatic, and then also just kind of navigating through what you saw. Again, not a good deal. So the Black Code, quite simply, was this. You can always vote if you can read. But you'd think that's not a big deal. Well, it's a huge deal because the majority of Africans who are now freed African Americans, right? These former slaves could not read. So that was the first thing. The Black Code was passed. But then also the grandfather clause, because again, when you look at oppression makes room for those that it wants to have included. It will always do so, not because it's white or it's black or it's native or it's Asian. It's when I want to oppress a particular group and I create a law, I'll make gaps for those that I want to fit into it. And so you had the Black Code that was created, but you also had the grandfather clause. Now, the grandfather clause was quite simply, if your grandfather was able to vote, then you can vote, which then this spared poor whites who could not read, whose grandfathers could not read, to vote. And so if your grandfather could not read and he voted, then you can vote because your grandfather voted. And those that made this rule recognize that post 1965, everyone who was black, their fathers and their forefathers weren't able to vote. And so this was a clause literally invented to have white folks who could not read be able to vote. Again, these are some of the Reconstruction laws that took place in the South. If you want to look up 1858 plantation badges, in my PowerPoint presentation, I've got a couple of real life police badges. This one says Plantation Police, Georgetown Community, 1858. Then there's a 1859 Slave Patrol badge. So as you look at the local law enforcement badges, these are two of the original badges. One was in 1858, Plantation Police, and the other one was 1859, right? And so those are a part of our history, and I think that it should be part of the knowledge that at what point can you point out where local law enforcement in the black community had a well-established working relationship? And I would argue, right, wrong, or indifferent, it has not, regardless of how modern we've become. The very first local police officers were mandated to catch runaway slaves, which it was legal to do so, but morally wrong. So we've got Jim Crow in 1878 to 1964, right? It was separate and not equal, right? So this idea, if it was separate and equal, doesn't today, any sociologist, any anthropologist that's worth their salt will tell you that the system set up by what's the word I'm looking for here? Reconstruction was not valid at all. So in 1964, we see the Civil Rights Act established, right? And so the U.S. is, let's see, 19, the U.S. is 245 years old as of July 4th, 2020. Yes, it is. And so oppression, right? So directed racial oppression has been in North America for over 345 years, right? And so this country gets established in 1776, but slavery begins in 1619. So the concept of oppression goes on well, by far longer than we've even been a country. And so, again, these are very impactful historical things. And if it's not a part of your background, that's fine. But not knowing this, right, is a problem because there are people who continue to pass down these stories after stories and communities that continue to still thrive. And if you happen to find yourself in local law enforcement and you're asking, I haven't done anything, what's the problem and why am I being treated a particular way? If you know the history of what's gone on, you can say, like, oh, I understand it. I still don't have to agree with it, but the idea of not understanding and not agreeing, not a good place to be. So I think that you can understand the woes of the community, starting all the way back to 1619 to 1865 to 1964, all the way to 2020. It's important if you are going to be in law enforcement and if you're going to serve the community, then you need to understand the context of the community. That's all I'm trying to say. It should also be noted that up until 1964, indirect racism and oppression were legal. You could literally oppress people and you could oppress them, separate them, stigmatize them, and there were no real legal ramifications for doing so. Again, lynching, which means hanging someone from their neck until they're dead, was the legal process way up until 1964. So with all that being said, I think I'm going to stop there on this part of the lecture. I've got multiple things to say, but I think it's important that you first have a strong understanding of the history of law enforcement as it relates to people of color in North America. It doesn't mean that things have not changed. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that things aren't better, because they are better. I'm not saying that we live in the same historical understanding. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that this is real live history that took place that needs to be understood. You don't have to agree with it, but you have to understand it did take place, that it's basically wrong and immoral, and we're now dealing with it today. And so we're dealing with it through the police becoming better trained. We're dealing with it with our riots. We're dealing with it as it relates to peaceful protest. We are dealing with it as it relates to disfunding the police, to disbanding the police. We're dealing with it as it relates to our political backdrop and who you're going to vote for. Because we did not, and I repeat, because we did not deal with race appropriately after slavery, I'm arguing that the past woes are engaging our current reality, and we have two choices. We can either do what's right or do what's wrong and continue to have problems. That's it for today. Take care. Peace.